Hello, everyone. I wanted to go over the week four study questions on Davis's essay about engineering as a profession. Number one, what point is Davis making by imagining a profession of torturers? This number one here is closely related to question three. Davis says immorality limits what can be called a profession. Do you agree with him? Well, it's actually quite a tough question. I think the point that he's making is that we would never countenance, we would never tolerate the notion that you could have a profession of torturers. And clearly, his definition of a profession, which is more or less arbitrary, let's face it, that is, that it's a group of people engaged in a common vocation. Practicing a vocation or practicing an occupation in a morally permissible way. That definition would obviously rule out torture. Although we had some conversation about that in our meeting earlier this week, I think that if you think that torture is morally permissible, then you could have a profession of torturers. But largely speaking, torture is considered so immoral and disgusting that at least that's what I was trying to get across in our meeting is that even if it were the case that in some cases, some very rare extreme cases, torture would be morally permissible, it would still be outrageous and disgusting and nothing that anybody would want to pursue as a profession, and that would rule it out. So I think the point he's making is that our preconceived notion of a profession is at its core moral. That is, there are moral constraints on what can be a profession, and the whole idea of a profession has a moral basis. So that if we're talking about something which is commonly accepted to be morally reprehensible, you couldn't organize a profession around it. Now, that leads us to number three. Yes, Davis puts moral limits on what can be called a profession, and the question is why? Well, that's a more difficult question because he clearly understands, I think, that customs and mores change so that what we generally sort of widely consider to be morally reprehensible may change through history. So certainly what we would countenance or allow for becoming a profession has got to change too. So it's all rather shaky ground, I would say. But if you accept his general outlook that the core of being a profession is something which is a moral core rather than something having to do with technical skills or education or even the importance of what you're doing, then I think you can see where he's coming from. Looking at question two, Davis offers his own definition of profession on page 8. What is your first response to it? Well, obviously, there's no right or wrong answer there, but let's look. He says a profession is a number of individuals in the same occupation voluntarily organized to earn a living by openly serving a moral ideal in a morally permissible way beyond what law, market, morality, and public opinion would otherwise require. What is your response to it? I mean, your response is whatever your response is, but let's see what's actually there. I guess the first part of it, that individuals in the same occupation, that's not controversial. Voluntarily organized, that would mean that anybody who was a practitioner of the profession would have to be a professor in the sense that they would have to profess their commitment to it voluntarily. Openly serving a moral ideal, that would be to accept basically the noble cause idea that Sagard had. In a morally permissible way, that would be to acknowledge the constraints of common morality, a conventional morality, and then beyond what law, market, morality, and public opinion would others require, would more or less, I think this came out in our discussion this week, more or less commit us to something like the altruism aspect that Sieghart laid out too. It's interesting how I think I might have remarked on this before. How without really knowing it, I'm pretty sure that he doesn't have Sieghart in mind. I don't even know if he's ever read Sieghart, but he's kind of, in a certain way, retracing the steps of Sieghart here. It's pretty interesting. So I don't know. I mean, what your response to it is up to you. But what's there is what's there, right? Moving on to question 4. Davis claims engineering has a moral ideal. Do you agree that it does? And do you agree with his particular version of it? Well, of course, whether you agree that engineering actually has anything like a moral ideal is completely up to you. Um, do you agree with his particular version of it? Well, of course, that's completely up to you too. But what is his particular version of it comes here, where he says the moral ideal engineering serves is also easy to state: the construction, maintenance, and improvement of safe, efficient, and useful physical systems, or in short, the material progress of humanity. Whether or not there is a moral ideal to engineering, I don't know. But I think that's what he puts here. I would say that, I mean, I don't. It's up to you. The material progress of humanity, basically, the material meaning the physical or well-being of human beings, as opposed to the spiritual. You might say that a clergy person of any kind is devoted to the spiritual progress of humanity, whereas engineers are about the physical world and the progress of human beings in their living in the physical world in terms of, as he says, their safety, um, their material well-being. So I don't know if that is good or not, but that's where it is, and that's what it is, and that's what you have to think about. Number 5, Davis claims that perhaps I can be a morally decent person without actively serving any moral ideal, but an occupation cannot be a profession unless it serves one. Do you agree? Well, again, uh, that's up to you, but what is actually there that you can be a morally decent person without actively serving any moral ideal? But you can't have an occupation that doesn't serve one. That's interesting. Which is to say, individuals can be blameless if they don't contribute to these things, but a profession has to be dedicated to contributing to it. So, if an individual engineer, just like an individual doctor or an individual lawyer, if they don't actively promote the moral ideal, then that doesn't mean they're bad. But a profession has to be, as a whole, devoted to it. It's an interesting distinction, and I think an important one. Say an individual engineer does not have to be actively engaged in consciously trying to move forward the material progress of humanity. That would be okay. But the profession as a whole has to be dedicated to that, has in some way or another, in its own constitution. Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Number 6, what does Davis mean when he says that professions must be professed? That is, at least implicitly, you have to say when you enter into a profession, I am a doctor, I am an engineer, I am a lawyer, I am whatever else. And I think that goes to the voluntary part of it and the identification with it. It has to be something that you are so saying to the world. Number 7, compare Davis's idea of moral ideal with Sieghart's noble cause. It'd be interesting to see if there really is any difference. I don't know if they're the same idea. I'd have to do more thinking about that, more close textual analysis of that. But on the surface, they're clearly similar ideas, and I don't know if they could very well be the same. I don't know. Number 8, Davis does not think that a profession has to be learned, and that's what I meant there. I didn't mean learned in the sense of just learned as taught. I meant learned. I think he meant learned in the sense of being something that is highly intellectual, scholarly thing that comes from years of study. That sense of learned. Do you agree? it's an important part because, of course, you know, he says, for instance, that we discussed this, that police officers could be a profession, but they're not learned in the sense that engineering, law, medicine, clergy are. It's an interesting step because it would, as we said, it would considerably widen the kind of things that could be considered professions. Because if there's no sort of highly specialized skills or things that take years of study, if those are no longer criteria, then it opens up a lot of things. As long as it has these other things, voluntarily organized, moral ideals, served in a morally permissible way, beyond what law and custom. A lot of things would become or have the status, perhaps, potentially at least, of being professions that aren't exactly learned. I don't know. I mean, I think I, for one, have a hard time letting go of the idea that there have to be sort of very special skills that take years of study. I don't know. I may be wrong about that. I think it's an interesting thing to think about because you sort of become conscious of what your own commitments are in terms of what you really are willing to see as a profession. And it differs from person to person. I recognize that. Number 9, Davis does not think a profession needs a written code of ethics to be a profession. What does it need to have? I think you're saying there needs to be a common understanding, even if it's implicit and not explicitly written down, about what the standards are and what perhaps the moral ideal is. So that there are countries where he clearly believes that engineering is a profession, although there's no official code of ethics, but that there's a common understanding between the members of the profession to adhere to a certain code, and that's really good enough. It's similar to the difference between the written Constitution of the United States of America and the unwritten Constitution, let's say, of Great Britain. So another interesting point.